So our first contributor is Anaí Alviso Merino, speaking on contentious politics and collective action through street art in Yemen, 2011 to 2013.
I slightly changed the title.
Well, that's okay. You tell them. That's
All right. In March 2012, a month after former president of Yemen, Ali Abdullah Saleh, formally left power, the walls of Sana'a were being covered by mural and spray paintings. A year later, Murad Sebai, the initiator of what became a series of street art campaigns, was being called by foreign media the Yemeni Banksy. Although the differences of perception are not at the center of my study, they point out the ways in which what international has been observed as urban and public art locally is being used as what I propose to analyze as a political awareness device. Connecting the study of emotions, collective action, and mobilization, French sociologist Christophe Treigny defines these type of devices as, and I quote, the set of material supports, the ordering and presentation of objects that militants deploy in order to incite or to cause emotional reactions that predispose those who experience them in order to commit or to support to the cause defended. So the hypothesis that I propose in what follows is to question street art as a device to express issues that become considered as worthy of collectively being shared and denounced, and the potential capacity of mobilization that this use of painting on public spaces can have in the short or the long term. Having participated in 2011 in the contentious occupation of public space at the anti-regime sit-in named Change Square in Sana'a, Murad Sebai's practice is connected to the street politics learned there, but my take is to study his street art campaigns as a new repertoire of action that develops in the period that follows the ousting of power of former President Saleh. This case study allows examining the intersection of space, contentious politics, and artistic practices, interrogating how dissent is expressed through street art rooted in street politics. More specifically, I interrogate the conditions that allowed street art to encourage political engagement, mobilize people, and provoke collective action in Yemen. So my studies focused, I will briefly describe, on Sana'a, Yemen's capital, and my analysis covers the street art projects developed between 2012 and 2014. My research for this paper is part of my doctoral fieldwork, which I carried out mainly in Sana'a from May 2008 until March 2011, when I was forced to leave the country for security reasons. So following that, I depended mostly on the internet. And of course, there are advantages, but also limitations, especially in methodological terms. But their choice or lack thereof, of course, can be understood, taking into account the difficulties of doing research in changing contexts as just any revolutionary public sphere. So as I do on my paper, I will start describing the contentious mobilizations, and then I will go to the campaigns. When Hosni Mubarak resigned in February 2011, a number of Yemeni students decided to camp at the doors of the new University of Sana'a, demanding the overthrow of the regime and rejecting institutional reforms thus far claimed by the opposition. A few weeks later, there were hundreds to participate in the camp called Change Square. The city's geography was intervened and underwent numerous and continuous changes. In a country where arms possession make it rank second after the United States, it is important to mention that all these diverse actors that participated in the camp, they left all the weapons outside the entrance of Change Square. So this sort of tented city worked as a complex and sometimes contradictory socio-political laboratory. The transformation of the square's life went from a festive and effervescent political, social, and cultural forum of ideas and activities at the beginning of 2011 to a progressively less active space disinvested toward the end of the same year, but notwithstanding recalled until the beginning of 2013 that street politics can induce changes. It was only dismantled in the first month of last year. The square served, to some extent, as a mirror of changes that its inhabitants had to face, so repression, the president's departure due to a transition agreement organized by the Gulf countries and political parties that were the only valid interlocutors, the maintenance of the old regime with immunity granted by this agreement, and the abortion and limiting of the scope of a revolutionary process. So, of course, and the analysis of the success or failure of this process is beyond this presentation, but the political and social learning that took place at the square remains central to my analysis. The fact that people enhanced their learning of direct political participation and political action from the street and in rejection to institutional politics is certainly one of the fundamental successes of this popular mobilization. As Saleh signed his resignation in November 2011 and formally left power in 2012, new forms of collective action took place both as a continuity of contentious politics and street politics learned at the square, but also as a break from these tented places. People practice participatory politics in the streets in many different ways. Among them, artistic practices were also combined with the expression of political claims. As the first months of the mobilization passed, some photographers and bloggers turned their attention to the streets surrounding the square, which was blanketed gradually by colorful graffiti and free writing, used to support at that time the mobilization. This practice was not unprecedented in Yemen. Before the revolutionary period of 2011, street art techniques had been used in Yemeni cities mainly to reflect religious messages through stencils displaying God is the greatest, or there is no God but God, or to reproduce also political slogans and symbols of political parties. As is the case also in other countries, art was not the first intention of their anonymous performers. Two cases stand out in the use of techniques associated to street art prior to 2011 due to the fact that they involved painters. The first one took place in 2006 when a group of female painters from the coastal city of Hodeidah chose a wall to paint their first collective piece. The second one took place in 2009 in Sana'a when several painters participated in making mural paintings that they hung on the walls of the old city, using space to display solidarity with Palestine at a time when Israel renewed attacks on Gaza. More recently, in 2010 and 2011, tags or signatures started to appear in certain walls of Sana'a. In 2011, these different techniques were being used in the walls nearby Change Square to usually reenact the slogans that were being chanted inside the square by the demonstrators. The word irhal, leave, largely written on the walls, also the asphalt and street signs, started to appear written both in Arabic and in English, but using colorful calligraphy. So, together with quickly spraying it, it also adopted new aesthetics. Also, fists were reproduced in colorful compositions. As we see here, people's silhouette marching in protest and holding the Yemeni flag, and also implied references to Facebook. In 2012, a series of changes occurred. Between March 2012 and the beginning of 2014, street art campaigns were launched by a young painter in his 20s through Facebook. Public space was again being used to express dissent and make social critiques, but this time through painting in a collective manner. To give a very short background, Murad Sobaid comes from a humble family, and he was greatly influenced by his older brothers, both of whom actively participated in contentious politics prior to 2011. Coming from this background and living not far from where the demonstrators started to set up the sit-in, he participated for the first time in a collective political action through his actions in Change Square. He was among the youth that started the sit-in in February 2011, and he quickly volunteered to monitor the entrances in order to avoid arms into the square. He also had begun to be interested in painting since a young age, and until 2012, he had never exhibited his work, feeling in his words that he was not ready yet to do so. What happens is that in March 2012 until now, April 2014, is that he has worked on 3 street art projects, which he describes in terms of campaigns. The first one, named Color the Walls of Your Street, was launched on March 2012 as a call to color bullet-marked walls where violent clashes occurred in 2011 between the regime and the demonstrators. When he started painting, he did so by reproducing his own paintings previously confined to canvases. They were all accompanied by 2 pieces of information typically present in pictorial art: the date and the full signature, easily legible, echoing the original canvases. The campaign in general was a success in which not only painters and those responding to the Facebook announcement participated, but also passers-by joined them as they painted. Print and TV media were also attracted by what quickly became a collective artistic action. Also, together with abstract images, for example, of giant faces, lists with Yemeni names written in South Arabian alphabet used in ancient times, and in general, colorful compositions appeared also next to paintings that carried more of a social comment. For instance, in this image, a child burning a gun, or in this one, the simple message, "I don't have a job," or the word jobless, announced the political use of artistic expression on public places as a device to render people aware of social problems. For Color the Walls of Your Street, Subai conceived a campaign that was, in his understanding, a way to distance himself from politics, which he perceived, in his words, as disgusting. He wanted to beautify his city at a time when power struggles disgusted him the most, and he chose to do so through painting on walls that could not be politically neutral. As reminders of the death the revolutionary and pacifist mobilization counted, bullet-marked walls were chosen in order to embellish the streets while remembering history still in the making. This project effectively distanced Subai from institutional and partisan politics, but rooted his practice in the street as a site for enacting social and political critique and as a place of memory of the revolt. He also undertook another campaign where he pasted photographs that were taken by his brother Jamil Subai, in which, for example, in this one, he wanted to express solidarity with the street cleaners doing a strike, or in this one, he wanted to offer aloe leaves, that's what we read, to the souls of people that were killed in a bomb attack claimed by Al-Qaeda. Or in this one, he wanted to denounce how Yemenis, in his perception, give their back and ignore what is happening. So following this project, he carried out a new campaign that started in September 2012 and continued throughout 2013. It was called The Wolves Remember Their Faces, and it was used to point out the forced disappearances in the 70s until today of activists, journalists, and citizens in general. The government, both in North Yemen, so 60s until the 90s, as well as in former South, ancient socialist republic, 60s to the 90s, and the current regime, 19th until today, are suspected of being responsible for the disappearance of an unknown number of citizens. The stencils included, as we see, a portrait of the person who disappeared, his name, a line saying enforced disappearance, both in English and in Arabic. His campaign not only served to point out an issue of social concern, but it also triggered a larger process of collective memory recovery. Participants to the campaign not only stenciled the images, but they also provided pieces of information about the disappeared citizens And the stencils ended up reaching the hundreds. They commented and exchanged information about their own disappeared family members. They participated in arguments with the military in the streets, and they became agents in the process of finding more information about the whereabouts of their family members or acquaintances. This campaign was clearly a contentious one, serving to make claims and demands to the authorities in power, and having several consequences to people outside the participants. The creation of a special committee to investigate and file the cases of enforced disappearance, the discussion over the elaboration of a transitional justice law, and the attention of the Human Rights Minister to promote debate at the institutional level are some of the consequences that followed this campaign. Although this issue was raised several years ago by journalists in 2007, it was this stencil campaign that produced the most important impact by the participation of the people, but also by including the issue in the political agenda, and especially by contributing to find alive some of the enforced disappeared. Finally, his last campaign, called 12 Hours, was designed to pass, in his words, messages of political content. He chose for this project images sprayed and brush painted, all again in Arabic and in English. The campaign falls as a series of hours. The hours is inscribed also in the painting. So between July 2013 and April 2014, 8 interventions or hours have taken place in which he addressed issues like the proliferation of arms, sectarianism, the kidnapping of foreigners, the idea of tampering with homeland, drone attacks, also poverty and civil war, and also the victims that recently died on March 6th after a terrorist attack claimed by Al-Qaeda. I will conclude saying a couple of notes. As I pointed out at the beginning of the presentation, since the summer of 2013, his work has been qualified as Banksy-esque murals. The social and political comment that characterizes the British street artist might be the only element in common with Subai's practice. The fundamental difference with Banksy, but also with the type of street art that is being artified in Europe and in the Americas, but also in Egypt, is the fact that Subai's campaign are collective projects conceived to provoke the public not only to look at the walls in a different way, but also to participate in the redefinition of public space. From a sociological approach, these campaigns are incubators of collective action, or as in the case of the Walls Remember Their Faces, are collective actions per se. In a more general manner, these campaigns have acted as effective devices for political awareness by using public space, provoking the participation of the public, and causing or inciting affective reactions that foster and extend the debate about subjects worthy of moral and political concern. However unexpected the scope of this practice can be, the limitations are also present. If during his first campaigns he was more assertive of the capacity that art can have to change society, since his last campaign his approach has turned more skeptical. He has pointed out the limitations of art as an inductor of change, right? But he's also well aware of the almost impossibility that his visual devices could make any change in terms of, for example, reducing drone attacks. If internationally the scope of Subai's campaign is reduced in this sense, locally he has been able to mobilize people both to activate collective memory, but also to induce changes that affected people outside his campaigns. Similar popular campaigns, including street art, have been undertaken, for instance, in Argentina, where also the lack of juridical actions triggered alternative mechanisms of collective memory recovery and denunciation. If in Argentina the role of popular justice initiatives, as well as collective actions for the sake of memory, are central to today's institutional and non-institutional politics, Murad Subei's street art campaigns might be the initial step towards popular and innovative ways of provoking changes in a country currently debating its fate. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Our next contributor is Noor Halaby, Hezbollah Logos and Their Parodies, a study of cultural production and carnivalesque humor in revolutionary times.
Yes. Okay. Yeah, me too. Is it all set up? Sorry, I got one. The theoretical framework I used for these parodies is the concept of carnival elaborated by Michael Bakhtin in his work Rabelais and His World. Bakhtin argues and he elaborates on feast, which he thought was the central concept of carnival, and I quote, "The feast was a temporary suspension of the official system with all its prohibitions and hierarchic barriers. For a short time, life entered a sphere of utopian freedom. The very carnival that end quote, the very carnival Bakhtin describes, and I quote again, is born in the festive atmosphere of images." And when looking at the Syrian revolution, as some of you have mentioned in the question time earlier, and I was very happy to hear that, is that the Syrian revolution marked some of the integral elements of Bakhtin's carnival, which is the notion of political leveling and the suspension of hierarchic norms of power that allows the emergence the emergence from predefined scripts. The particular reason that the Bakhtinian carnivalesque analysis is relevant to the Syrian sphere is because at the moment of the revolution and earlier, Hezbollah specifically was very popular, specifically after the Lebanese-Israeli war. And so in a certain way, there was an emergence from the hegemonic scripts by parodying Hezbollah. Before I begin speaking about the parodies, I just wanted to provide an analysis of the original logo in case some people were not familiar with it. So the logo is in green color against a yellow background. The green is very denotive of the Islamic references of the party and its agenda. And then below, the party identifies itself as the Islamic resistance movement based in Lebanon. The text itself reads Hezbollah, which is the party of God, and so the party claims its legitimacy from God, essentially, and then rising from that logo is the rifle, which is the source of the party's military power and its might. Now, as we will see in the parodies, these central elements become very central to the parodies. The first parody I want to talk about is Jihad Artani's cartoon that appeared in a Saudi newspaper. And it reveals what Bakhtin argues is a contradiction between the hegemonic text or the Hezbollah's agenda and the reality of their intervention in Al-Qusayr. And so in this parody, the reversal, Bakhtin speaks of grotesque realism, and one of the elements of grotesque is the representation of the absurd, or a world à l'envers, or a world topsy-turvy. And in this sense, the reversal of directionality in the rifle of the logo really represents that notion. The next parody I wanted to show is, these are two parodies, one of which is created by Hajjaj, who basically argues, it's an argument on the lack of political authority or political autonomy of the party. It decrowns the party, it uncrowns the party through its argument of the lack of its own self-ownership of its own power. So here, the main source of, the central source of power for the party from the original logo is the rifle. And in this recreation of the spoof, we see that the rifle is being held by the word Bashar, denoting Bashar al-Assad. And so it sort of uncrowns the party by the lack of authority it has over its own means and its own resources. The next spoof, this is again by Jihad Artani, this again appeared in a newspaper, is a spoof, it's a parody that provides the same idea, but it provides an image of Ayatollah Ali Khamenei holding the rifle. So again, providing an image of uncrowning of the party because they no longer hold power over their resources. And finally, the last spoof that I wanted to speak about, which is the spoof Akalna Khara. Please excuse the language for some of you who speak Arabic, and now that I translate, please excuse the language again. It is a colloquial expression that means we ate shit. And as you can see, the visual elements really highlight that again. So the visual elements, as you can see, replace the text with the words we ate shit, and in the middle, again, excuse me, in the middle there's the image of the bust of Nasrallah holding a spoon, which is then held by the fist. That again, we see that the central image of power that the initial logo denotes here is entirely reversed into an image of humiliation. And the AK-47, which mentally is still present in our minds because we are very familiar with the logo, is now the source of the party's humiliation. The feces on the right really drills it home, but it also, the reason it's there is because the idea of the colloquial expression we ate shit has been overused. And this logo is really trying to bring it back. And the notion that Bakhtin brings forth in his research is this notion of grotesque realism. He speaks of scatological humor, which is in very crude terms, and some people speak of it that way, it's called toilet humor. And it's humor that speaks of feces, it speaks of, well, let's not go into that. But it's humor that's, well, and so what this parody is trying to drill home is it's the ultimate degradation of a person, representing them in these terms. Bakhtin calls it bringing down to earth. And he says it's the ultimate way in which you take the venerated and humiliate them to the most extreme measures. And in this spoof, as you can see, so the Nasrallah bust, which is almost not apparent to us, it's partial. It's attached to the spoon and to the source of humiliation. So it seems that this spoof targets Nasrallah mostly as the leader of the party, as the sort of central figure. It targets him mostly with this argument of degradation and humiliation. So finally, I wanted to provide an idea of the context that surrounds these spoofs, because we almost forget what this means in terms of So it's not necessary to go into the exact details of all this recording, but this recording emerged from the FSA Tansiqiyat, which is the protest organization committee of Al-Qusayr. It was initially the first leaked walkie-talkie sort of radio recording of Hezbollah fighters in Al-Qusayr. It was before the official declaration that Hezbollah was involved. And the FSA, when they released these recordings, and this is the first time that this parody emerged, when they released these recordings, they coupled it with this particular parody, the Akalna Khara parody, which really tries to show that the parodies are they're not released in regular circumstances, but they are released in this very violent circumstances of revolution and what that means. So finally, this brings me to why I think this research is relevant. Perfect timing. So this brings me to why I think this research is relevant to us here as we speak about the public sphere and as we speak about the role of media, which is, I feel that this research offers a new interpretation of political branding. Because the literature on political branding assumes that each political party has a sort of hermeneutic monopoly over the images that it disseminates into the public sphere. And what this shows, particularly in the context of revolution, is that once you release these images, as Roncière calls it, you create a coupling of a sentence and an image, so an image and its signification. But as it's released, there are multiple ways in which these images can be reinterpreted, reappropriated to different discourses, but also they can be entirely flipped on their heads, as Bakhtin shows, in the way that the AK-47, for example, the symbol became the source of power in the Hezbollah rhetoric, but then it turns into the source of humiliation in these parodies. So in some way, this research and this case study offers a new way to look at that literature. But the other way I thought this research was interesting is to look at our notions of the public sphere, and I realize this has been criticized again and again, but this research highlights the sort of emotive element of a political brand and the emotive element of its parody. And in both times, both in the brand and in its parodies, the type of argumentation that's made in the individual decision-making process is very affective. It's not entirely rational. And so that defeats our understandings of the public sphere and the political decision-making that an individual makes. And in certain ways, the way that political brands are conceived as a place marker on the political, sort of environment, these parodies show that they're not as placed as they really are. They're very fluid. So finally, this brought me to my last question, which was, as I conclude, and as I ended working on this paper, and it's still very much a work in progress that I go back to again and again, but it raised the question of how much, as researchers, we notice political argumentation happens in the rational sphere, and how much of it happens through the means of the designated ways and hegemonic scripts of political discourse, and how much happens through the carnivalesque appeals that we saw today of joy and fear and repulsion and awe. And this is, I feel, where this paper has left me, and this is where I'll conclude. I hope I'm still on time.
You're still in time. Thank you. Thank you very much. Our next contributor is Adel Iskander. The Politics of Memes, Irreverence, Intertextuality, and Irony in Revolutionary Egypt.
Thank you. Okay. All right. Thanks very much for the kind invitation, Marwan and Marina. I'm just going to start off by sharing a few. Oh. All right. Nobody's activating it remotely, right? Okay. So I just want to start off by offering a few disclaimers. Oh, it does have a life of its own. Okay. So I don't know why it's doing that. Okay. So I want to offer a few disclaimers. First and foremost, given the time constraints, I'm going to move very quickly. I'm going to speak very quickly because I want to absolutely get through my presentation. So we'll leave. I want to get to the last slide. The second disclaimer is that because of what's been stated previously, many of these online spheres are extremely not only contentious, but they're also an opportunity whereby communities come together and share material and information in a discursive fashion that violates social norms. And so there's a significant amount of profanity and vulgarity. I say these words with all of the weight associated with them. So I apologize that nothing about this presentation is politically correct, but nevertheless, that may make it more interesting. The third disclaimer is the fact that it's extremely context heavy. So as much as I possibly can, I'm offering sort of translations and interpretations, but nevertheless, these are very much situated discourses. So as you can see here, this image is one that emerged prior to January 25th and circulated fairly widely online in many of Egypt's social media scenes. It depicts, of course, the famous Jacques-Louis David painting of Napoleon crossing the Alps from 1805, but of course Mubarak is sort of splendidly depicted in juxtaposition with that background. It's utterly ridiculous, and it's meant to be ridiculous. But really it speaks to a growing sort of discourse surrounding memes and what memes have come to mean. Now the idea of the meme, the terminology itself, without sort of dwelling too much on it, comes from Richard Dawkins' The Selfish Gene, and is quite problematic on a variety of levels. He argues, again, why is it doing that? Okay. He argues that a meme is basically the unit of cultural transmission, but unfortunately for Richard Dawkins, there's very little room for intentionality. That these memes basically have a life of their own, which understandably is a decent argument, but nevertheless it comes down to a really sort of situated evolutionary deterministic logic, which I think is very problematic. Which is part of the reason why the discussion around memes hasn't made the cultural turn that we would anticipate it to do. So the research that I'm doing now, while it's in progress, is meant to continue what most of the conversations that we've had thus far are all about, which is to theorize memes, but not to confine them. So the intention here is to avoid the essentialization of meme activity, but nevertheless be able to historicize them, to develop a phenomenological approach that acknowledges intersubjectivity in the process of meme creation, and also acknowledge the self-referentiality that exists within memes. And in addition to that, I also want to point out that typically when we think of the semiotics of memes, we forget that there is a semiosis in the sense of that there's a moment of inscription where an idea develops meaning or it develops some sort of meaning. In this case, I'm showing the image of Khalid Saeed because there's a tendency for us to interpret or perceive the Egyptian protest movement as a social media movement, and of course we've, I think, both problematized that and debunked it enough, but nevertheless it remains a salient argument, and it's one worth bringing up specifically in the context of memes because there's a tendency to perceive my discussion, or there might be a tendency to believe that my discussion is a continuation of that theorization. So it is actually a critique, but it also is intentionally meant to be a problematization of the perception of the Arab public sphere in the manner in which it's been articulated as reflected by news media as well. So there are these two juxtapositions that are quite problematic. And of course, this also became a meme. I'm going to skip through it quickly because it's very problematic and difficult to watch. So are these social media uprisings? Perhaps the answer is, who cares? And the reason why this isn't particularly important is because, unfortunately, there hasn't been a genuine attempt at developing a critical genealogy of how memes come into being, or how ideas go viral, and why they go viral, and why they become situated, and in what context. There are, of course, memes that we're all familiar with in the Western context. This is Mitt Romney, infamously saying binders full of women, which in a span of maybe 3 hours, 150,000 people had joined a Facebook group, and we all of a sudden get these types of iterations. In this case, we've got, gosh, I don't know why it's doing that. We've got, someone who knows a little bit more about binders full of women kind of articulating that critique, and it becomes sort of a feminist undermining of a highly paternalistic discourse that is recognized collectively by the community at large. But there are other memes that are quite resilient and highly recurring. Keep Calm and Carry On is a 1939 poster meant to anticipate and undermine people's concern. Okay, so things are moving faster. I guess it's divine intervention, meaning that I should move forward as well. Okay, so memes, the idea here is to look at memes in a way as living history. So there's, this is another example from outside of the Arab world. It's called the Riot Kiss from Vancouver. Again, the juxtaposition of the authoritative state and a moment of intense intimacy. The juxtaposition is meant to be absurd, and we see the way in which it's all of a sudden placed in various historical junctures. The infamous, Sonny Liston punch by Muhammad Ali, and then again Michael Jordan's infamous, flight, the royal wedding, and in this case Gladiator, and the Tiananmen Square confrontation between the student and the tank, and of course Beatles' Abbey Road. And in this particular case, we have Delacroix's famous painting of liberty leading the people from the French Revolution. And you can see how these juxtapositions are a critical part of creating an argument about omnipresence and repeatability. So the topic here, I'm going to pause it before it moves ahead. Okay. The topic here is all about cultural production online, experiential engagement with politics, and counter-hegemonic expression. Those are the three basic currents that underlie the discussion. The image at the bottom of the screen is one of Yao Ming, an NBA basketball player that has become a staple of meme generation and meme critique. It is meant to depict irony and sarcasm. And in this case, the quote reads, "We made the greatest revolution in human history, but we forgot to hit save." And this meme, or the face of Yao Ming, was used quite frequently ahead of the revolution, before there became sort of characters, Egyptian characters for meme. Oh, gosh. All right, sorry guys. I don't know why it's doing that. Okay, so the omnipresence of this particular meme is it's so much so that there are memes created to identify the extent to which it is omnipresent. In this case, you've got the former Egyptian president Mohamed Morsi saying, "Inta fadihni fi kull hitta al face." You're scandalizing me publicly on Facebook. And he says, "It's not my fault. You're so ridiculous." And he has this sort of tongue-in-cheek face about him. There are other sort of contexts in which, or the argument that I'm trying to further here is that there is sort of an interesting temporality associated with how memes are created and for what reason. So in some ways we see the appropriation of yesterday's symbols, today's politics, and tomorrow's literacy. The intention is to shift public opinion or to shift political discourse in an interesting way. Now, for most of you who know anything about Egypt will understand that a simple snort means a lot more than just a snort. And in this case, the Sphinx, which has become a recurring symbol within meme generation to represent deep disenchantment and disdain at the status quo, is responding to a constitutional court judge in his very lengthy reading of an addendum that precedes the presidential election results that eventually led to or were announced as Mohamed Morsi's success. He says he speaks to the Sphinx and says, "I feel you have something to say, but you can't." And he says, "I want to snort, but I can't." Another interesting meme that came about shortly thereafter, again, the important thing here to note is that there's a sense of collective identity that develops from highly critical junctures in popular history. And of course, very few 30 seconds of video have ever been watched by this many people in a single country. So the 30-second announcement by Omar Suleiman that Mubarak was going to step down ended up creating sort of a largely fictionalized historical moment that became ripe for inscription and appropriation in interesting ways. Probably the most compelling thing about this particular image and video was not Omar Suleiman or the two plants on either side, but rather the gentleman right in the middle. Why is it doing that? Okay, the gentleman right in the back. His name is. Nobody knows his name. He's known as the man behind Omar Suleiman. And interestingly, he himself became the subject of a very, very widely circulating internet meme. Here we see him, in The Matrix. We see him behind Shadia in a famous film. Oh my goodness. Okay. Okay, it's going through them really fast. I can't help it. Anyway. A lot of interesting ones. Another interesting character is why is it doing that? Okay, you get a glimpse every time, but so another interesting character is Hazem Salah Abu-Ismail, a candidate for presidential elections who was disqualified on the grounds of having a non-Egyptian mother. All of a sudden, he went from being a fairly sort of constituency-based character to being a very widely known individual in Egypt. And it had something to do with the omnipresence of his posters in public space. This is a photograph that proceeds to zoom out from top to bottom, where you see his posters plastered on a wall with incredible frequency. The frequency at which his posters became present in public space led to an online viral meme. So here we see him with Angelina Jolie, and again, yeah. All right. I don't know why it's not cooperating. I'm sorry this is as difficult as it is. Anyway, there are other interesting character memes that were generated in Egypt specifically. A Sahbi is one of them. He's meant to represent a particular character. I don't have time to explain this character, but he's meant to be just the average young person who's disenchanted and is, of course, placed in many different compelling contexts. This is really turning out to be quite horrible. I can't present those quite well. All right. You know what? You know what I'm going to do? I will actually not do it in slideshow form. Is someone remotely controlling it? Okay, because it says remote here. Okay, so this character is called Black Days. He's a young man who gave a quick interview on an online, for an online service, and all of a sudden he became sort of a notable figure. All he said was that we're living through black days. And so when the interviewer asked him to explain or elaborate more, did you sign a petition for the removal of Morsi? He says, we're just living in black days. And that became very interesting. So here he's Abdel Fattah al-Sisi. Here, keep calm. I can't keep calm. These are dark days. Here, he's the Sphinx. So all of a sudden, he takes on so many different characters. What I want to point out here is that there is a tendency for absurdity to be depicted in such a way so as to appropriate folkloric narratives and ideas. For instance, we've discussed thus far several examples whereby historicized moments represented largely by popular culture. For instance, famous plays like Madras al-Mushaghibin or Shahid Mashaf Shahaga that all of a sudden are able to be sort of inscribed over and over again to represent, in some cases, the problematic or the absurd. And of course, I'm not going to go back to the discussion of the grotesque, but there are significant examples of the grotesque and the profane in the context of the Egyptian memosphere. This is one interesting example. This is a famous porn star who just so happened, with the intent of undermining the religious discursive argumentation of the Muslim Brotherhood ahead of the constitutional referendum of 2012-13, many activists decided that they would create these sort of ironic situations whereby a porn star like Gianna Michaels, I believe is her name, marks yes for the constitutional referendum that essentially enshrines Islamist articles. And then, of course, it often manifests in the form of intriguing heteroglossic examples, such as this, where Karl Marx is known to have said, Islam is the solution. I'm sure all of you are familiar with that particular quote. But what's even more compelling here is the way in which national symbols are being used used and appropriated in a very particular way. The key here is the identifiability of these symbols. So here we've got an image, of course, the image of the Egyptian flag with the revolutionaries after having gone through these ebbs and flows of deep disenchantment and disconcertment. They've been stabbed in the back so often. But of course, we also have examples where the omnipresence of sexual harassment ends up being depicted as such a central part of the Egyptian flag. So you can see how, and of course the blue bra girl, for those of you who are familiar with that particular incident where a woman was violated and stripped in public in Tahrir Square by the military. And of course this is the original image itself. And Ayyam Soda, of course, a very common image. But the original flag depicts Salah ad-Din's eagle. Now there is sort of a tendency for this alterity to mainstream in an interesting way and increase its distribution capacity. Bassem Youssef himself has been a large part of the commodification. I'm not going to say the commercialization, but the commodification of memes by using these sort of aphorisms or intriguing, compelling, contradictory quotes. Some cases, this commodification manifests in the form of, some of you may have seen these videos already, gas and alcohol don't mix, and then it can turn into a billboard in Egypt that is meant to advertise public space for further commercial usage. Now, why is this important? Why is this relevant? I think it's relevant because there's something quite intriguing about the Egyptian memosphere, if there's such a thing. The Egyptian meme space is accented by an absolutely massive explosion of activity. Here we're talking about Facebook pages dedicated to meme generations and meme communities, whereby 4.4 million people may be following a page. Hundreds of thousands of people are active on any given day, and that a counter-hegemonic discourse is constantly being generated day in and day out in response to political activity and political expression. This is one of the most recent ones. Some of you may have heard already about the hashtag Vote for the Pimp in Egypt, which is probably one of the most popular hashtags in the Arab Twittersphere history. In this case, there's a picture of Abdel Fattah Sisi, or what is claimed to be a picture of Abdel Fattah Sisi saluting Abdel Nasser back in the day, and there's a photo of Hitler so as to suggest the fascistic tendencies of the current regime and its supporters, and it says, pimping at an early age is like engraving on rock, and it rhymes better in Arabic. And before I close, I just want to say that these meme communities are very, very interesting. These are just examples of some of these meme communities on Facebook. As I said, the largest one has 4.4 million followers, the Egyptian Sarcasm Society on the top right-hand corner. Ikhwan Ma'taf Bil Budan is a very anti-Muslim Brotherhood page that has over 2 million followers, and various others. And these communities are extremely interesting in the way in which they create all of these. Now, memes exist in these various forms internationally. This is from Gezi Park. Each of those symbols have their own entrenchment, their own ideas, their own historicization. This is from Ukraine. This is from China, also having very, very profane, suggestive implications. And this is from Thailand. So I don't have time to dwell on those. But in leaving you, I just wanted to say that I myself have been toying around with memes, and I thought I would create my own meme that I think is relevant for this particular moment. I don't know if you can see it. So, given the fact that can you see it? So this is Marwan Kredi reminding us that the politics of contention and the public sphere is far beyond the news construction, and it has all of these different characteristics embedded in it. The genealogy, the connection to a popular cultural motif, a critique of a generalized identitarian perspective, and also the counter-hegemonic, if one were to believe or to interpret the focus and the incredible sort of rampage of Al Jazeera-focused content as hegemonic, which I think it is. Marwan had once said that writing about Al Jazeera has in and of itself become an industry. So this is the memification of a critique of Al Jazeera and brings together sardonic power, folkloric intertextuality, and thankfully not the grotesque. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Our final contributor is Amal Khalaf, Reclaiming Bahrain.
Great. Hello, everyone. I just want to say thank you very much to Marwan and for inviting me here. It was really great meeting you a year and a half when I first started to talk about Bahrain and the Pearl Roundabout. And I've been since working and writing about it. And I just wanted to start with an image. And this is what I've been talking about for quite a long time now. So this is the image of the Pearl Roundabout at the moment of its death on the 18th of March, 2011. Previously, and in my paper that I'm submitting for this book that we're all working on together, I've spoken very much about the digital public sphere and the central role that the Pearl Roundabout as a symbol has taken in developing a kind of public sphere and the beginning of what I describe as something like Chantal Mouffe's agonistic public sphere. And by that, I just wanted to explain a little bit about that. Her agonistic model of public space is a battleground where different hegemonic projects are confronted without any possibility of final reconciliation. It radically questions Habermas's public sphere, where citizens resolve disagreements in a drive for consensus. She describes the public context in which dissensus occurs as agonistic space. This is a space in which different, sometimes oppositional perspectives and powers compete with dominant hegemony. In Bahrain, the representations, visible or otherwise, including the naming of the roundabout, and so this is the Pearl Roundabout, or Dawar al-Lu'lu', as it's known. Its original name was Dawar Majlis al-Ta'awun. It was named after the Gulf Corporation Council. It was built in honor of the first GCC meeting in Bahrain in 1982. Since its destruction and during its life as the site for public occupation and protest in Bahrain in 2011, it took on many, many names. A lot of people in the media called it Midan al-Lu'lu' or Pearl Square, and it's been called Midan al-Shuhada, Martyr Square, and it's been made fun of and called Dawar al-Mut'a, Popcorn Square, and many, many other things, Dawar al-Shisha. I was in Bahrain recently. I was there just a few weeks ago, and it's been three years and 1 month since the Pearl Roundabout was torn down, and I was struck by how I was constantly in a car at a checkpoint. People couldn't move. It has just become part of normal life. And as someone that lives in London that goes back to Bahrain every few months, I start to notice changes. And I was just really struck. And I just can't talk about the digital sphere so much today. I really want to try and start to speak about public space and the way that power and critiques of power are really being inscribed into urban space through architecture and images, be them temporary or more solid. So as parts of Bahrain have transformed into new territories of dissent, where roundabouts have become squares and spaces for political action and speech, political graffiti is visible almost everywhere, and roadblocks, tire burning, and decentralized protests are part of everyday life, we see the scenography and spectacle of revolution in Bahrain. Some Bahraini citizens have stopped thinking resistance and instead are performing resistance. And as a result, the government have in turn sought to redesign the urban fabric by increasing securitization, inscribing its power on the spaces of the city, and attempts to remove any traces of dissent that can transform cities into scenes of transgressive politics. In addition to the ongoing shrinking of civic space through privatization and these increased security measures include checkpoints, barriers, blocking vehicular and pedestrian access, and restricting entry to many areas of the island, altering what the island has meant to everybody over time. So I just wanted to remind ourselves of what the Pearl Roundabout was for that month. I wanted to speak a little bit, very quickly, about the idea of the roundabout. I mean, the idea of the roundabout was an early 20th century model, and it was like a civilizing model. It was to create the modern subjectivity. No longer would you need 8 policemen to control intersections. As a modern subject, as a civilized subject, you're able to self-regulate. You can control yourself. You know, there's a special contract between the government and the people. over how you're supposed to behave. So unlike a sanctioned public square, which are often controlled by regimes and governments, the roundabouts being taken over, you see it as more of a stronger commons. It's really where you have this imminent collectivity. There's a level of disobedience. You're bringing traffic to a halt. You're bringing the flow of the neoliberal system to a halt. And for a month that happened in Bahrain, despite violent and deadly attacks by security forces. And the protesters here that we can see, I mean, they occupied the square for, I think it was just over a month, and they really were challenging the dominant logics of the relationship between land ownership and power in Bahrain and redefine the role of citizenship. So going back to this image, this is a still, these are like 3 stills from a 50-second clip. It's the only clip, I think, that exists of the destruction of this monument. And it was 2 days before this happened, Saudi tanks rolled across the causeway, our umbilical cord to Saudi Arabia, and thousands of troops came into the country from Saudi and from Emirat. There was martial law declared. The square was finally cleared for the last time. And on the 18th of March, we were, everybody woke up on their phones, computers, and TV screens to this rolling, repeating 50-second clip of the Pearl Roundabout collapsing on itself. There was a PR announcement. There was a press conference, and the foreign minister, Sheikh Khalid bin Mohammed Al Khalifa, a very active tweeter, said it was they had to remove it to end this bad memory. This action is reminiscent of the ancient Roman practice of damnatio memoriae, a condemnation of memory. And the practice includes, this Roman practice includes the destruction of images of a person deemed by government decree, an enemy of the state. Such a decree meant that the name of the damned was conspicuously scratched out from inscriptions, face chiseled from statues, and statues themselves often abused as if they were real persons, while frescoes would be painted over and coins bearing any image of the blacklisted were defaced, and any documents or writings destroyed. This happened with the Pearl Roundabout. The Pearl Roundabout is featured on the Bahrain 500 fils coin. That coin was repealed, like that's been cancelled. And it was once a big feature, you know, it was like on all of the tourist boards, and, you know, Bahrain's the pearl of the Gulf, and it really was taken over. It really became its own symbol. In demolishing the roundabout, it became clear to all who watched the 1-minute video that was aired again and again that this speechless stone monument, which once had symbolized state-sanctioned progress, had become an enemy of the state. And his punishment was erasure. But of course, we know that you can't erase these digital images, and I mean, there was really, like, if you Google Pearl Roundabout today, all of the images that you will see are images of protest and of transgressive politics in Bahrain, okay, of course, I mean, you can't beat when it becomes this visible and Robert Fisk is standing outside Pearl Roundabout, the government just gets very angry. So this is what the Pearl Roundabout looks like today. It's still barriered off and you cannot access it. It's been renamed as well. And despite all of these attempts to erase it, Lulu is a powerful symbol for thousands of people, recasting their ideals in the monument's image. It's called a Midan, and in its death, the Pearl Roundabout took on a life of its own, becoming the symbol of a protest movement, the star of tribute videos and video games, and the logo for internet TV channels, and the subject of contested claims, rebuttals, and comments wars. I think it's in this image that we can see of the broken bones of Lulu, that we can start to see the space and geography of Bahrain as something elastic and under constant transformation. Just as the checkpoints around the island today are constantly changing their modulation of what and who is allowed to move where, we can see here that the power of space is not in its rigid stability, but rather in its constant transformation. It's in this elasticity or elastic geography, as A.L. Weizmann has once used in order to describe the architecture of occupation in Palestine, that you can start understanding that construction and destruction are continuous with each other, complementary actions rearranging matter across terrain. Politics becomes space in motion, matter in transformation. So this is another image here with similar bulldozers. These are images of land reclamation in Bahrain. So there has been, like since 1970, an estimated 19 kilometers square of coastal waters in Bahrain that have been reclaimed. This is Manama, like my grandmother's house used to be 5 minutes away from the sea. It's way over this way. It's now 3 kilometers away from the sea. Most of this land is destined for private development, and the government make a profit selling this land. Public beaches in Bahrain, which is an island, it's an archipelago of islands actually, make up 3%. So that's 3% of public coastline available. And this is in a country that's named Bahrain. It's 2 C's if you don't speak Arabic. It has a strong identity as with a relationship with the sea, fishing, pearl diving. And we're seeing this increasing encroachment of land, privatized land that are surrounding villages, villages that depend on fishing for their livelihood. The northern coast town, for example, which is the most densely populated part of Bahrain, so you see lots of images like that. It's happening so fast. Like there I am driving and I'm in the sea apparently. But there are 11 islands that are being built in the northern coastline of Bahrain, which completely block out several villages from access to the sea. So yeah, I wanted to just say, like, these images have created in the past, like in 2006, a PDF circulated around Bahrain, which showed all the private islands that feature resorts, private marinas, and for royal family members, which are the same size as very, very densely populated islands in Bahrain. This is Bahrain Bay. I just wanted to speak a little bit about neoliberal images that circulate around Bahrain. So this is in Manama, not too far from where the Pearl Roundabout stood. It's being built now. It's going to be like this. Images like this are just everywhere in Bahrain. It's part of this idea of like business-friendly Bahrain. So for a long time, we'd get business-friendly Bahrain stamped on our passports. That's how like strong this idea of like a neoliberal, how important the image of like a smooth neoliberal space for business is to the Bahraini government. It's also, Bahrain is also the freest economy in the Middle East. So tax-free haven for everyone. And of course, images of unrest really damage this PR campaign. So I'm going to skip through because I have a lot of things to talk about. I'm going to quickly skip through this. This is an image. I wanted to talk about other ubiquitous images apart from these shiny developments that are all over the island that you see on billboards, which kind of really, really exacerbate the widening gap between the rich and poor in Bahrain. But the other ubiquitous image, which of course anyone that's gone to the Gulf and many autocratic countries in the world will see, is that you will always have images of the ruling family everywhere. And these images I took at the 40th annual art exhibition in Bahrain. And it featured a wall of pictures of Sheikh Khalifa, who is the longest serving prime minister in the world, looking at art. And this was an artwork in the exhibition by Rashid Al Khalifa. This is just an idea of the scale. And this image is made up of tiny images of the royal family and their properties. So I just want to skip through to the next image, which is another collage, and I want us to bring back to this idea of elastic geographies and the scenography of the revolution in Bahrain, and talk about the walls that you see everywhere in Bahrain. And more, you see them in Manama, you see them in a lot of villages. You don't see them maybe so much on the walls and walls near highways and malls, but for a long time you did. In Bahrain, they don't paint them over white or paint them with pretty murals, although they're starting to do that. In Bahrain, here these are images of political prisoners in Makharga, my grandma's neighborhood in Manama. Here you can see the symbol of Lulu, Lulu here, and it says Aidun, we will return. The images of Lulu are everywhere, but I really wanted to show these images. Like, it's a very conspicuous conversation between the government and those that are creating these transgressive images. That's a stencil of Abdul Hadi al-Khawaja, and that's been painted over in baby pink. Here's another one. And there's Lulu again. Time to stop. I think that I just want to quickly skip through. I wanted to talk about how the power of the symbol of Lulu is a constant tool and image. It's been used, these recreations of Lulu have been erected on roundabouts in villages across Bahrain in actions where the riot police have to come back and like tear it down again. So there's like a constant remaking of history and violence there in these political actions. You'll see the Lulu everywhere. But I wanted to speak about a tiny bit about this. This was the Revolutionary Museum, which was set up by the Al-Wafaq Party. It lasted for 3 days, and it kind of depicted the history of protest and in Bahrain, starting from the 1880s onwards, because Bahrain has a long history of dissent. It didn't just start in 2011, and there is, like, in living memory, many stories and many occurrences of the protests and uprisings. And here they depict, they create recreations of things that have happened in the recent and distant past. Here you see a recreation of a torture room and raids. And of course, it was raided within 3 days and taken down. Quickly, I just want to talk through these images to take us back to...
I think people do deserve a chance.
Okay, all right. Well, yes, I just might leave with this image then. I'll conclude with this image. So, yeah, all over the villages in Bahrain, you'll see these kind of roadblocks everywhere because they're being raided very often, sometimes daily. But these spaces in the villages really remain these spaces where there's open dissent, graffiti everywhere, open discussion. Obviously, there are police coming in, people being taken away, people that are, many houses have people that are missing or tortured or have been in the past. But I just wanted to talk about how these pockets of spaces remain and how even these quite symbolic borders and barriers are becoming markers, new markers of architecture of power in Bahrain today. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Well, as with for the earlier panels, there's clearly enough material here of great interest to keep us going for 2 days. It's very frustrating to have to squish it to this degree, but at least we have the chance to do it. So we have about 10, 12 minutes for questions and discussion. So as before, I'll take the first 2 or 3 and group them. Yes.
Thank you. So I have a question for Adil. Okay. A serious one. Thank you for the presentation and for the compelling ideas about the self-referentiality, intertextuality, and the memes. But I have 2 questions, actually. First relates to the the meaning beyond this proliferation of memes on websites and Twitter and Facebook and social media after the ouster of Mubarak, and how it relates to how far can we understand memes and parodies as an deflection or expression of common depression, common feeling of tragedy of the prospect and the outcome of the revolution, or the contradictions between the promises, okay, that opened up in 2011 and the tragic course of events that unfolded in the following years, following months, okay, taking into consideration that many of the artists and many of the activists and people who are circulating this are really in a deep matter of depression, okay, and psychological disorder and not optimism, but pessimism, real pessimism, okay? So this is the first thing, because I have a concern. I'm concerned actually that maybe celebrating this kind of new art, okay, would, and you know we are standing on the same ground, okay? I'm really suspicious about some interpretations that would, I don't mean you personally, but I think some interpretations celebrates this idea of self-referentiality as an alternative or as an exit door for serious questions in the society. Okay. The second question.
Okay, could you just maybe hold the second question for a moment so that other people can have a voice?
A quick question, maybe a bit strange to Amal. The first time I heard you present about Lulu, and then when I read your essay afterwards, and today, you're talking about a monument with a kind of intimacy that makes it a person for me. It's really, there's almost a tenderness in talking about the monument, in your voice, in your tone, in your intellectual argument. Is this, if you don't mind me ask you, is this you, or is this how people in Bahrain actually feel about the monument? Because I find it quite remarkable.
Okay, we have 3 more, and we'll call a pause there and let the panel to work.
Actually, my question is also about this, because it seems like bringing it down is an act of suicide of a certain idea of the nation. You talked about GCC being held there. So obviously there were problems with this project, right? But its collapse is almost like really eradicating it. And the outcome is Al-Farouk, which is Omar bin Khattab, and Saif Ali as holding it. So kind of a Sunni Shia kind of replacement of this. So there is almost like a suicide of the nation in a way that I think is also very powerful in this. So.
I have a question. Thanks everyone. I have a question to Adil, and it asks to Saeed. When do memes get exhausted, or with such kind of it's replicated again and again and again? We get the humor at the first point, like at some point, but it can be overloading to the sensorium. So especially, and this is the second part of my question, that the way you read memes are online, you roll quickly, takes flashes of seconds, you just share it. It's a very quick, replicated, and I just want to know when does it get exhausted? Thanks.
Let me try this. I think one of the things that's so interesting about all of these memes and these images is trying to think through a logic of translation and significance and how to understand them. And the effective quality of them is why we are interested in them in some way. And And I wanted to suggest a kind of logic for thinking about it that, for me, comes from looking at similar kinds of symbols in a perhaps unexpected context, and that would be American patriotism, but the issues are all the same. And that is, in some ways, the reference symbol. It's often a hegemonic symbol, but what does that mean? That means that there's an assertion of power that's connected to violence and death in some way, or calls for sacrifice by people. And that is really important to us. And then a kind of counter-hegemonic symbol is always going to be taking that reference symbol and then rethinking it through grotesquerie or something. And when Bakhtin talks about the grotesque, he's always talking about a process of fecundity and sexuality and generativity. And so it's kind of this effective contrast of death and life. And I think that there's a way in which a lot of the, not all, but a lot of the symbols that we've been looking at, the Hezbollah symbol, for example, so you have the rifle that represents both the power of Hezbollah to kill and the sacrifice that it requires of its members, and then the grotesque version of it, which is the community remaking itself or regenerating itself. And that kind of dialectic between essentially sex and death seems to me a very common feature of these kinds of symbols. Certainly true in the case of the American flag and all its variations, for example. And I think the politics are different in terms of what people prefer, but the kind of visual rhetoric that allows people to become effectively involved with either the reference symbol or the challenging symbol seems to me very much related to these things. And I'm curious as to whether the panelists think that's a resonant idea or not.
Thank you very much. Okay, panelists, you've got some opportunities here, but I would ask you again, if anybody here wants coffee, that you kind of really focus your responses.
Can I go ahead and start? Okay. Mohammed, I first have to apologize for the presentation appearing to be mostly sort of an attempt to sort of entrench parody and satire as something to laugh about. And to an extent it sort of is, but each of those slides were actually layered, and unfortunately I wasn't able to really unpack many of these ideas. Now, the real question here is the need to focus on how irreverence for many of these communities and online sort of activists who appropriate this approach to challenging both the status quo and the authorities and the hegemonic powers at large. For many of them, it is largely a coping mechanism, and so we see that sort of desire to speak back or talk truth to power, if you will, even if it's a very sort of marginal expression that has, the scope of which is quite limited. It's still in some ways self-affirming. It is self-referential, but there's something to be said about the extent to which many of those memes are actually deeply fatalistic and really express a tremendous sense of melancholy and sadness, but nevertheless finding kind of something to really laugh about. So maybe there's an element that associates these with coping. I mean, the desire to cope and to respond and to contend, and that this terrain itself, these spaces, are not ones where the government or the authorities or the regime actually have an upper hand. So we see that happening to this day. And I'm going to tie that into the second question that Yaqeen posed about when do these become kind of, old or uninteresting, or what's the shelf life of some of these memes. I would argue that had the political circumstances in Egypt been different, memes could have been rendered irrelevant, or that these spaces would have been uninteresting. But because of the sort of the temporal immediacy and the extent to which the contestation between the regime in its sort of authoritarian configuration continues against these very, very marginal subjugated groups that do have a little bit of a utopian imaginary as to what they would like to see, those spaces remain sustain contentious spaces. And as long as there is a sense of inventiveness and innovation, I mean, some of them are, as I've described, some of them harken back to or evoke or appropriate ideas that are deeply folkloric. The images or videos that come from masrahiyat or theatrical plays from days past, or from films that people are typically associated with. But there are also regenerative ideas, such as, let's say, the new military invention for the cure of HIV and hepatitis C. And so, because the news cycle is constantly generating absurdity, there's a tendency for the grotesque to continue to create new ideas. The shelf life of a particular meme only lasts as long as the news cycle renders it relevant. But the meme has to, you know, the authors or the inscribers of these memes have to come up with interesting ways to reinvent them or rediscover them. So the Hazem Abu-Ismail meme, for instance, the Salafi candidate, is sort of a forgotten meme. It's one of the very, very early memes. But guess what? We're on the heels of another presidential election, and this guy happens to be in detention. So people are coming back and say, well, guess what? What would it be like in this imaginary space if he were to be resuscitated and to come out and to compete in an election? You have a new generation of memes developing in that respect.
Okay,
So
Adel, I think
newness.
your fellow panelists also need a word here. So.
Sorry.
Thanks for those questions. I don't think Lulu is a person, but I have a strong affection for objects with that much power, I guess. But I do. They're both great questions, and I think that I really didn't get myself together enough to kind of speak about really about the images and the importance of the symbol of Lulu, and to talk about generally the kind of images, the use of space, the takeover of meaning, the constant exchange and takeover of meaning of spaces, of symbols like Lulu, that's happening in Bahrain. And I think it's really a battle. For me, like, the crux of it is like, who's allowed to claim those meanings, and who's allowed to claim the space, the land, and who's allowed to claim an image of the future. I mean, those images I was showing you, the shiny images of Bahrain Bay, those are all made by architects in London and elsewhere. I don't know where, but you know, those are the people kind of designing images of the future of Bahrain. And I think, like with Lulu, it was quite an insignificant roundabout. Many people thought it was ugly. I mean, I just thought it was amazing. It was like a very Khaliji modern kind of iconic image that I grew up with literally from when I was a kid, seeing every day, going to my grandma's house every day. So for me, you know, I did have some kind of affinity with this piece of architecture, but I think that in terms of the idea of it representing the end of nationhood, I think it's more that people are able to reclaim it from a top-down kind of naming or designation of what it's supposed to be. And it's that was so contentious. Once, you know, Robert Fisk is standing outside of it, there are 7 million images of it on Google with protesters outside, it starts to become a huge threat, which you know, qualifies it for like execution or whatever. So yeah, but I'd love to speak to you further about the sectarian kind of that moment, the very powerful messages that came through in this whole in that whole game of destruction.
So I just wanted to respond to Dr. Marvin's question. Thank you. That's precisely why I think I was interested in these parodies, is because Bakhtin mentions this quite a few times, is this notion of humiliation, degradation, defecation being linked to a birth, in the same way that death denotes the birth of an unofficial truth or a second truth, which in some ways represents how parody acts. So parody represents something again, but comes up with a new truth. And in other ways represents how the death of one thing denotes the birth of another. And it's definitely how these parodies represent themselves, is, in a sense, they treat one political actor as the degeneration of their politics is in the same way a moment of opportunity for the revolution.
in one way, because they're involved in the crisis and they're involved in fighting people, that their degeneration could also be a moment where you're being liberated from a party that's taking part in killing people. And it's also opening up in a political view the arena to other actors that could then claim the space and try to create more contestation than having just one party. Thank you. It was addressed to her.
Okay. Okay, I'd like once again to thank our 4 contributors very warmly for what they have shown us.